January, and there is no deal. The agreement of Parliament was that the government should make a statement and Parliament should be able to vote on it, and that it should be amendable. Now, the Minister said that if, on the unlikely event, there is no deal, that would happen. However, we need urgent assurance from the Attorney-General that the government will not find a loophole in this by saying that there is a deal, even though we haven't voted on it, and thereby avoiding the requirements of Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, which would require the vote by the 21st of January. So, in other words, by never quite getting round to offering a vote on this deal until it is too late, but also not having a vote on no deal, keeping us in limbo. No vote on the deal and no vote on no deal. If the government were to do this, it would be a constitutional outrage. It would be upending the spirit of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, but much worse, it would be letting the country either drift or forcing the country into no deal without a parliamentary vote. So we need written assurances from the Attorney-General on the government's interpretation of the Act, and we need that assurance that even if there has been no vote on this deal, even if they're still claiming that the deal applies, if there has been a no vote on the deal by the 21st of January, then the government will still abide by Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, and ensure there is a statement and an amendable vote on its plans, including whether or not this means no deal, and that will happen under any circumstances by the 21st of January. Now, I make no apology, Mr Speaker, for my purpose in doing this. I already think that the 21st of January is far too late for businesses and departments who will already be thinking that they've got to chuck everything at preparing for no deal. But I want to stop this country careering into no deal, either by accident or by deliberate intention of the government, with all of the damaging consequences for jobs, for prosperity and for our national security, without Parliament having a say and without Parliament being able to stop that happening. Even if other members do not agree with me in that purpose, I hope they will agree that this Parliament cannot be ignored, and that is why we need the Attorney-General's written advice.
Well, I have great respect for the Right Honourable Lady, and I understand that she came to this House expecting to have a row about the government's interpretation of this, and I understand the questions that she has just asked. But what I would say is I have responded to this question as my department is responsible for the legislation which enacts this, and which I have given her a very clear interpretation of that legislation, which is that we will have a vote in this House, a motion before this House by the 21st of January. And that is in all those different scenarios that I talked through in my statement. So the answer is very clear for her. We respect the decisions which were made by this House, that the government should come back to the House with a motion in the event that no deal had been agreed, or in the event that this House had rejected a deal. That was clear from my statement. What we are therefore saying is that there will be that motion by the 21st of January, and I agree with her. I would much rather, and I fully expect it to be sooner. And I fully expect this House to have the opportunity to debate a withdrawal agreement that this House will be able to support. And so let us work together to achieve that, but let us not allow some of the conspiracy theories and the scare stories that have been told about this to run away when I have just clarified the government's position.
Nicky Morgan.
Very much indeed, Mr Speaker. I have great sympathy for the points made by both the Minister, who I think is acting with integrity, as he always has done in his parliamentary career, but also for the points made by the Honourable Lady. It is unquestionable that this Parliament must have a say, a meaningful vote on the deal or no deal that comes about. Can the Minister give categorical assurance that there will be no trickery by the government to stop Parliament having a say?
No trickery.
Well,
Minister,
my right honourable friend, and I'm grateful for her words. I'm very happy to give that categorical assurance. As I think my statement reflected, we will be putting before Parliament a motion, even in the circumstances where no deal was before the House. But I strongly believe and expect that there will be a deal before this House, which I will be urging Parliament to support.
Nick Thomas Simmons. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, for applying for this urgent question, and to you, Mr Speaker, for granting it. I'm grateful to the Minister's response, but the reality is that the Attorney-General should be here to speak about the legal implications of this agreement. Yesterday, the Prime Minister used the phrase in this House of an accidental no deal. That she used the phrase is itself evidence of a dereliction of leadership, Mr Speaker. Section 13 of the European Withdrawal Act is therefore crucial in this House being able to prevent a chaotic no-deal outcome which would do enormous damage to our security, our economy and our society. So can the Minister answer these questions? The Prime Minister's official spokesperson has reiterated today that the Government will bring back the meaningful vote by the 21st of January. Isn't it completely contrary to the national interest for the Prime Minister to run down another 6 weeks on the clock when all she is seeking is reassurances and clarification on a document that Parliament already understands? And if we are relying on the Government's word, or to use the Minister's phrase, its clear intention that the Government will keep the 21st of January deadline, rather than the clear force of the law, doesn't the Minister understand that this week of all weeks that constitutes no reassurance at all? Yesterday, the Prime Minister was unable to properly answer questions about the legal force of the 21st of January deadline, and the Leader of the House could not properly answer questions about the legal status and force of the amendment of the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman for Beaconsfield. Let me just say, the reassurance that was just given by the Minister means nothing without the legal backing of the Attorney-General, who isn't here. Isn't the truth, Mr Speaker, that this decision to pull the vote was made in a panicked haste without thinking through the economic, political and constitutional implications for our country?
Mr Walker.
Well, the honourable gentleman made my point very clearly when he said that, yes, the Prime Minister's spokesman has said the same thing as I said this morning from the dispatch box, that there will be such a meaningful vote before the House before the 21st of January. He also talked about acting contrary to the national interest, and I think we're very clear on what acting contrary to the national interest is Labour's approach of blindly opposing any sensible steps that are taken by the Government to secure a deal while proposing no alternatives.
Get your retaliation early. Mr Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his statement. Can I just pick him up on a couple of points? The first one is this. Section 13 procedure presupposes that the Government has an initialled deal with the European Union. And, of course, we have such an initialled deal, which is why we started debate on it last week for the purpose of deciding whether the House should or should not approve it. In those circumstances, can he provide an assurance to the House that if the initial deal is continuing in its current form, then in those as initialled, the House can complete its consideration not on a day just before the 21st of January, but expeditiously, as was clearly provided for under the Act. Secondly, may I also take it from what he said that the Government now accepts that the amendment that was tabled to the procedure under Section 13 to allow for amendable motions thereafter is now fully accepted by the Government as it should prevail in future?
Minister.
Yes, and I commend my right honourable and learned friend for the points that he's raised. I agree with him. I have given that commitment from the dispatch box with regard to his amendment there, and that does mean that the motion would be amendable. And with regard to the Government, the House being able to complete its considerations expeditiously, I think we all have that in mind. I think the Prime Minister has made clear her determination to seek out those assurances, listening to the concerns that have been raised in the House, and then to come back swiftly to this House so that we can complete those considerations.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr Speaker, this is a government which has been found in contempt of Parliament and which continues to demonstrate its contempt for parliamentary democracy on a daily basis. It's clear that the government prefers to communicate with MPs through the lobby briefings than on the floor of this House. And it's also clear that the government is trying to evade its legal responsibilities by failing to have the Attorney-General here to answer this question and putting the Minister up. I see the Solicitor-General is on the front bench and engaged in anxious conversation. Why wasn't he put up to answer this question? Mr Speaker, it's been made very clear in the last 24 hours by many Member States of the European Union and by Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk that there is no question of any meaningful renegotiation. So can I ask the Minister now for a cast-iron guarantee that the initialled deal will be brought back to this House for a vote before the 21st of January, and if so, on what date, and that motion will be amendable? And if he can't give me that cast-iron guarantee, will he look seriously at the possibility of putting this deal to the people of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom to see whether they want this deal or whether they would prefer to stay in the European Union on our current terms and conditions, as the Court of Justice made clear is possible yesterday?
Minister.
The honourable and learned lady, of course, should pay attention to what I already said in my statement, which is that we will be bringing a motion before the House, either, as I much prefer, on this deal, with the assurances that the Prime Minister will by then have one, so that this House can vote on that, or, even in the circumstances where that were not on the table, we would be bringing a motion back before the House. But I say to her, she raises the idea of a people's vote once again, and we very clearly had a people's vote. We had that people's vote across the whole of the United Kingdom in 2016. It is our duty as members of this House to deliver on that.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Minister for his clarifications, but can I press him on one point that I don't think he covered? If there is, under Section 13(8), a statement at some point before the 21st of January, as there must be under that section, if the Prime Minister has by then concluded that she cannot complete a deal, is he confirming that that statement will be accompanied by a motion which, though in neutral terms, will be amendable? Or did his point about the amendment cover only a statement of motion under sections 13(1) and 13(4)?
Well, Minister, my right honourable friend is typically meticulous in his questioning. My understanding is that the intention of the House in passing that motion is that it should be amendable in all 3 cases set out in section 13.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. I'm afraid the Minister, for whom I have great respect, has not wholly succeeded in his aim of providing reassurance to the House, because what we learned yesterday is that today's assurances can disappear tomorrow like a puff of wind. Now, can he clarify the following? If the withdrawal agreement comes back, the government says it will, before the 21st of January, and is defeated, then legally speaking, for the purposes of Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, is there still agreement in principle with the European Union? This is a very important point in view of the previous question that was asked, because even if it is defeated, for the purposes of the Act, the only thing it refers to as agreement in principle has been reached. Now, the Prime Minister, the government said on I think it was the 28th of November, agreement in principle has been reached. So can he just clarify that that remains the case, even if the withdrawal agreement is defeated?
Minister.
I have great respect for the right honourable gentleman, the work that he does on the Select Committee, but I have to say in this case I don't share his interpretation. I think Section 13 is very clear in looking at scenarios where either a deal had not been reached or if a deal had been voted down, then a statement would be required, and that is my understanding of the commitment we made. We need to come to this House and have that vote, even in the circumstances that a deal had been brought before this House and turned down.
J. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just to press further on this point, could my honourable friend clarify whether, in light of the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, whether the government still maintains that a political agreement has been reached in line with the statutory statement presented to Parliament on the 26th of November? As things stand today, have we still got a valid initial deal?
Minister.
I think the Prime Minister has been clear that, of course, we have reached an initial deal with the EU, but she has listened to the concerns of this House in going back to seek to discuss that and to seek assurances on that. I think that means that she will want to put before this House a deal with those assurances and to ensure that this House has its meaningful vote on that arrangement.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, I have some sympathy for the honourable gentleman because he's doing his best to give us assurances in this House about what's likely to happen. But the fact is that he's appearing here on behalf of a Prime Minister who has completely shredded her credibility by what she did yesterday, who was prepared to send her cabinet colleagues out to make one assertion with confidence in the morning while she was plotting to reverse it at the same time as she had them in front of the TV cameras. Why should we believe a single thing, despite his personal integrity, that the Minister tells us today?
Minister.
Well, I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I believe I'm standing here on behalf of a Prime Minister who is seeking to do the right thing for the country, who is seeking to bring us together and seek to secure an agreement that is in our best interest and that this whole House can support.
Maria Miller.
My right honourable friend has been absolutely crystal clear that there will be a meaningful debate, a meaningful vote. Does he share my concern that the benches opposite are more interested in driving damaging uncertainty rather than supporting the Prime Minister, who is trying to deliver the best deal for this country?
Well, frankly, I do share that concern, and I think we see today that there's a focus on process versus outcomes. I think we should all be focused on getting the best outcome from the whole of this process.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately for the Minister, and I don't think he should take this personally, any assurances this government gives have the half-life of one of those isotopes that we're all so worried about. He must be aware that there will be an absolute uproar in this House if the government try to engineer by trickery or chicanery avoiding having a vote on this deal. But can I ask him, can he give us a categoric assurance that if, as is expected, amendments in support of a people's vote are put to that deal, if we do get to vote on it, the government will not seek to thwart any such amendment and vote?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman that to have from the Liberal Democrats a suggestion of assurances not being worth the paper they're written on is quite strong. But I would also say to him that we have voted many times in this House already on a second referendum, and every time it has been defeated, because clearly the majority of members of this House want to respect the people's vote we had in 2016.
Sir Desmond Swain.
When we get the vote and vote for the agreement, at what stage can we subsequently walk away from trade negotiations should the terms prove sufficiently unattractive?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend asked me a question which is well beyond the scope of this urgent question, and so I'm not going to attempt to answer it at this time.
Liz Kendall.
Why would anyone believe a word the government says on when the vote will take place, when ministers have spent weeks promising the vote would be today, and when the Prime Minister's only hope of survival is to delay the vote till the last possible minute to try and force MPs to change their minds?
Well, I simply don't agree with the Honourable Lady's narrative. I think that the Prime Minister has been very clear that she has listened to this House, she understands the concerns that there are across this House, and she wants to take those back to European counterparts to make sure that we have the best deal before this House. And she will then bring it back here and she will put it before this House to decide on.
Very engaging wave from the honourable gentleman, the member for Wantage, but it's not a normal means by which to procure the attention of the chair. So, and it would be a pity to squander the honourable gentleman at such an early stage of our proceedings, so I'll come to him in due course. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you. In 108 days, we run out of road, and the only red line that has not been laid down is the one in front of the cliff's edge, falling into a chaotic no deal. Can I urge the Minister and the Government to bring forward the meaningful vote to next week, because by then, at least, we will know what cosmetic changes have been made in Brussels.
Well, I'd
Minister.
say gently to my honourable friend, I think we should make sure that the Prime Minister has the opportunity that she seeks to make sure we have the best deal in front of this House, to make sure that we have the assurances in front of this House so that the whole House can get behind it. And she is a great champion of working across party. I think we ought to be taking this forward in a way which is cross-party and that delivers for the whole country. But I don't believe that it would be right, therefore, to rush into having a vote of this nature before we had sought those assurances.
Then Bradshaw.
But given the fact that the NHS and thousands of businesses across this country are going to have to start planning, implementing their plans for a no-deal contingency before Christmas, wouldn't that be grossly irresponsible? And what possible reason can he give for refusing to hold the rest of the debate and the vote next week?
Well, I'd say to the right honourable gentleman that he should be working with us to provide that certainty and stability that the NHS and many others will by securing the agreement and by securing the implementation period that it provides. I think that would be in the best interest of all those organisations of whom he speaks.
I can't wait any longer to hear the mellifluous tones of the honourable gentleman. Mr. Ed Vasey.
Well, I fear I've raised the bar too high, Mr. Speaker, but I was going to say that it seems unlikely the Prime Minister will get any substantial changes to the withdrawal agreement, and so it is beginning to look like she's withdrawn the vote for her benefit and not for Parliament's benefit. Isn't it time to bring back the withdrawal agreement, have the vote, and then allow Parliament to make a decision? Like the Minister, I do not favour a second referendum. I would like Parliament to reach a conclusion on Brexit.
Minister.
I think we are all clear that Parliament will have its crucial say in this process. That is why I've made this statement, to make it very clear that there will be a meaningful vote before Parliament, and I agree with him that that date of the 21st January is at the back end of when we want to see that. We want to see it come sooner. I'm sure the Prime Minister will be striving to ensure that she can bring it back to this House even sooner than that.
Lisa Nandy.
Considered the withdrawal agreement in good faith, but time after time the Prime Minister has broken her word, and over the last 2.5 years she sought to withhold information not just from this House but from the public about the impact that these different options will have on us. I have businesses in Wigan who aren't bidding for contracts because they don't know if they'll be able to deliver them. I have thousands of food manufacturing jobs at stake, and I have smaller food manufacturing firms who will go under if no deal becomes a political reality. So will he begin to restore some trust in this House from those members of Parliament whose votes the government still supposedly seeks, and tell us today categorically that this government will explore every option, including extending Article 50, before they will allow this country to leave the EU with no deal at all?
I'd say to the honourable lady that we have before us an option to make sure that we leave with a negotiated deal with an implementation period. The Prime Minister is seeking to improve that still further to make sure that this House has the best option to move forward in an orderly basis, and that is the route we should take.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I genuinely believe that there are members on the backbenches of the party opposite who, like me, want to avoid a no-deal Brexit or the risks of a very divisive second referendum. So can I urge this Minister, who I know to be a very thoughtful listener, to spend some of the time that has become available in his diary with some of those backbenchers on the party opposite to see if their concerns can be addressed.
Well, I'm always happy to take my honourable friend's advice, and I would certainly be happy to do that.
What about your own backbenchers?
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, there are circumstances in which, under Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act, the Government is required to make a statement on how to proceed by January the 21st. Those are if the Commons decides not to approve a deal presented by the Government, or if no agreement in principle can be reached. But the House of Commons Library, in its note prepared overnight on this, says, and I quote, "If the Government maintains that its political agreement persists, the requirement to make a statement could be avoided." That's why this side of the House is suspicious. Is the Government's strategy
to continue to give us a meaningful vote, or is it instead to run down the clock and, in the words of the Godfather movies, in the face of no deal, to make us an offer that we can't refuse?
Well, let me just repeat to the honourable gentleman, because I think it is an important question, and I think I have provided the answer. Let me just repeat the line towards the end of my statement in answering this urgent question. Let me say this very clearly. In the unlikely and highly undesirable circumstances that, as of 21st of January, there is no deal, not a deal before the House, the government would bring a statement to the House and arrange for debate as specified by law. I think that answers his question precisely.
Mr. David Jones.
Section 13, subsection 2, provides that the meaningful vote should, so far as practical, be held before the European Parliament decides whether to consent to the withdrawal agreement. Now, the withdrawal agreement has been concluded, but not approved. Can my honourable friend assure the House that the meaningful vote will take place before the European Parliament makes that decision?
Yes, I'm happy to give him that assurance.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, this whole situation is bonkers, and the public are frankly fed up with this carry-on. We already know the impact it's having on the academic sector. So will the Minister confirm that allowing this to drag into New Year is simply unacceptable to the electorate? And will he categorically rule out the possibility of the government waiting until March before announcing no deal?
Well, I'd say to the honourable lady, I couldn't have been much clearer in my statement earlier that we will be having a meaningful vote before 21st of January. Now, I'm very clear. I want the Prime Minister to go and get the assurances she seeks and to come back to this House as soon as possible. I'm sure that's exactly what she intends to do.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my declaration and register of interest. This is important not only for everybody in this country, but for people in Gibraltar as well. So can my honourable friend reassure me, A, that the initial deal, as at this moment, still exists, and it is still a legal deal on the table, because that certainty is really important for them, and B, take on board from those of us who want to support the deal that the sooner it is brought back, the better for those of us who wish the Prime Minister well in what she's trying to do.
Minister! My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and he and I have both recently heard directly from the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who's very clear in his support for this deal, because he thinks it meets Gibraltar's key interests and preserves British sovereignty. These are absolutely crucial points, which I look forward to supporting when the deal returns to the House.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry to sound suspicious, but the Minister has used two words in his statement which make us all suspicious. He's used assurance and reassurance, which we've heard time and time again from this government, and then they have reneged on. So given there is a vast majority of MPs in this House who wish to prevent a no deal, and indeed the Chancellor repeated that in Treasury questions just before this, will the government either rule that out now or bring a motion to this House so we can vote on it and rule out a no-deal scenario?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman that what we are talking about is Section 15 of the Withdrawal Act. That is Section 13, which is issues this House has already debated. What I've delivered today is the government's clear interpretation of those and the fact that there will be a meaningful vote before this House.
William Ragg.
Mr. Speaker, could my honourable friend confirm that motions of this House, amended or otherwise, do not override the law?
My honourable friend, of course, is right that the law has a senior and more important effect, but what we are talking about here is the law. We are talking about the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will understand that yesterday shredded all the goodwill that was left in this House when it comes to these assurances. And I listened to the Attorney-General last Monday when he told this House that he had a solemn and constitutional duty to advise it on these legal questions objectively and impartially, and to place such legal expertise as I have at its disposal. The historical precedents strongly support that view. The House may be sure that I shall discharge this duty with uncompromising and rigorous fidelity. So the fact that he's not here today to give that legal weight to what the Minister is saying is a concern to all of us who have to go back to our constituents and explain what on earth is happening in this place. Can he therefore confirm that the Attorney-General has consulted with him on what he said today and that he will publish any legal advice he's given in the light of yesterday's rulings and what happens on Section 13?
Minister! I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I'm sure if she were to approach the Attorney-General, he would discharge all his responsibility. But this question was about an act for which my department is responsible. Of course it is right that I should be at the dispatch box as a Minister for the Department for Exiting the European Union to answer questions on our legislation.
Robert Goodwill.
The leader of the Labour Party regularly attends meetings of his European socialist colleagues, many of whom are actually in government. Is the Minister aware of anything whatsoever positive that has come out of those meetings that has facilitated the deal and helped deliver it on Brexit? Or is it the case that the Labour Party, as far as delivering a workable Brexit is concerned, is part of the problem, not part of the solution?
Order. I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for his inquiry, which suffers, however, from the rather notable disadvantage that there is no responsibility of the Leader of the Opposition for the formulation of policy or the continent-wide attempts made to secure an agreement, and therefore I emphasise upon advice that there is no responsibility on the Minister to attempt to answer what was no doubt a well-meaning, but in practical terms is a disorderly question. Mr Vernon Coker.
Mr Speaker, can the Minister confirm, once again for the benefit of this House and for the country who are going to read his remarks and listen to what he said, that there are absolutely no circumstances, no legal interpretation, no scenario which may or may not crop up over the next few days or few weeks which will deny this Parliament the opportunity to vote on whatever the government comes back with or not. Because I tell you this, Minister, as the Minister has heard from across the House, the trust in the government is such that he has got a lot of work to do to make people believe him.
Minister.
Well, I'm very happy to say I think the short summary of my statement is there will be a meaningful vote. There will be a meaningful vote in all circumstances, and so I'm happy to give them that assurance.
Sir Oliver Heald.
Honourable friend referred to the withdrawal agreement bill that would follow a successful vote for the agreement. Does he agree with me that this will be a major piece of constitutional legislation covering some important issues? For example, citizens' rights, how they're embedded, where the law, what the legal base is for laws during the period of transition, what the duty on our Supreme Court is in terms of the CJEU decisions, and so on. What steps is he going to take to make sure there is an opportunity to consult widely on this and to make sure that we're not left with inadequate time to consider very important points?
Minister. My friend makes a very important point. This is a crucial piece of legislation as we move forward. And of course it's right that the House should have its meaningful vote first before the introduction of the withdrawal agreement bill. But we've been doing a huge amount of work to prepare that piece of legislation. We've published a white paper on it, and we shall continue to engage with the House and its select committees on that area.
Vera Hobhouse.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has mentioned on a number of occasions recently, including her statement yesterday, it's her deal, no deal or no Brexit. How is the government actually preparing for the Prime Minister's third option? If she's taking it seriously, why would she otherwise mention it?
I think the Prime Minister has been very clear that that is a political comment about the outcomes if other people were to take control. We are very clear we will not be revoking Article 50. My Secretary of State made that very clear yesterday, and therefore it is a question of having an orderly withdrawal with an agreement or no deal. I think the orderly withdrawal with the agreement is much the preferable of those two options.
James Heapy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's absolutely right that you, your clerks, the Library and the Government will want to agree the rules arising from the legislation thus far passed so we can have certainty over the Brexit endgame. But, Mr Speaker, that endgame is the most chaotic and uncertain scenario imaginable within the entire Brexit process. So are we not better finding common ground now so that we can support a deal and deliver Brexit for the British public?
I wholly agree with my honourable friend. I think he makes a very important point, and I think it is really important that this House now works together to ensure we can find that common ground and we can improve the withdrawal agreement when it's brought back to this House.
Angela Smith.
And if this country faces a no-deal exit from the European Union, the fault for that, the responsibility for that, will lie squarely with the government and particularly the Prime Minister. Is it not the case, having listened to the Minister this afternoon? Is it not the case, listening to the Minister this afternoon, that what we're facing now is not a meaningful vote, but rather a blackmail strategy?
Minister. Absolutely not. What I've made clear is that under all circumstances this House will have a meaningful vote. But I think it is incumbent on MPs on all sides of this House to remember what they promised to their electorate in terms of delivering the outcome of the referendum and getting a good negotiated deal. That is something we should all be supporting when the withdrawal agreement returns to this House.
David T.C. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend tell me if members opposite continue to oppose any of the very generous compromises that are being put forward, at what point will he withdraw the offer of £39 billion for the bureaucracy in Brussels and spend it preparing for the full, clean World Trade Organisation Brexit that over 17 million people have voted for?
Well, Minister, as always, makes his point with great force and with great power. But what I'm talking about today is the government's commitments to this House and how we will meet them, and I want to focus on that. We have put before the House a withdrawal agreement, which of course includes settling our dues with Brussels, but crucially also ending them, taking control of our money as we leave the EU.
Dame Louise Ellman.
Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister failed to put before the House the deal that she herself described as the best possible negotiable deal. And now she's travelling the capitals of Europe pleading for help. There's a growing sense of chaos in the country and a feeling that the government is simply not in control. Doesn't the Minister agree that one of the options he should be considering is putting this issue back to the people with an option to stay in the EU, the best deal we have?
Minister. I don't agree with the Honourable Lady because I think it is incumbent on all of us to remember that it was this House that legislated for the referendum. It was this House that promised people that their views would be listened to and followed. And it is for us, therefore, to deliver on the outcome of that referendum, as both our parties promised in their manifestos just last year.
Alex Chaw.
It's vitally important that the House has its say on this crucial issue, so I'm grateful for the Minister's assurances. But the 21st of January is nearly 6 weeks away. Does he agree with me that that should be a deadline, not a target? If this matter can come back before the House, it should do. We need to resolve this at the earliest possible opportunity.
Well, I'm happy to agree with my honourable friend wholeheartedly.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, is that nobody believes them anymore. No. And that is exactly why the Attorney-General should, as my right honourable friend said, be forced to come to this House and to put in writing the assurances the Minister has given. Because the Minister has simply been put up as chaff today for other ministers above his pay grade who, quite frankly, are willing to resort to any level of trickery and contempt for this House. And that's the reality. Can the Minister tell me, speaking of trickery, and can he be very, very clear about this, were any EU member states or any EU officials or European Commission officials informed of the plan to pull the vote before the Cabinet discussed it and before this House was told?
I have to say, chaff is a new description for me, which I'm honoured to receive from the honourable gentleman. But I have to say to him, what I've been in front of this House doing is to be very clear on the government's interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act and to answer that we will have a meaningful vote. I'm not here to speculate on other matters.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The contempt with which this government holds Parliament seems to know no bounds. The answers of the Minister today suggest that it's either their way or the highway, and that is not good enough. Parliament's voice must be heard on this issue. And apart from the Minister's word, what consequences, what actual consequences are there if the government doesn't bring a vote to the House of Commons by the 21st of January? There seems to be no consequences for holding Parliament into contempt. There seems to be no consequences for pulling the vote that should have been taken place today. So what will be the consequences if the government doesn't bring a vote before the 21st of January?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady, the government will bring a vote before 21st of January.
Mrs. Ellen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we had a significant judgment from the European Court, which does open up another option. So when the Minister tells the Attorney-General that we want written advice, can the Attorney-General take into account yesterday's judgment in what he sends us?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I'm sure the Attorney-General takes into account all judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union, but I don't believe that changes the policy of the Government, as my Secretary of State made very clear yesterday.
Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 21st January is a long way in the future, particularly for those businesses and for those EU citizens whose lives are on hold, who are struck with uncertainty. The Minister said he thought this could be brought back for a lot earlier than that. Could we hear a bit more of the Minister's thoughts? Why, given there's 4 sitting weeks, more than 4 sitting weeks, can we not have this vote before we break for the Christmas recess?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman will know that the date of 21st of January is, of course, set in the Act, and that's because that is what Parliament decided should be in the Act. What I would say, I've been very clear that I would like to see this being voted on before then, and I think many of us across the House would like to see that. I would also point out, though, when he talks about European citizens, I think this is very important. I think the deal that we have negotiated is the best way of securing their livelihoods and allowing them to continue as before. But of course, the Government has also made significant commitments about unilateral steps we would take, even in the absence of a deal.
Karen Park.
It meant extra cost and extra disruption for business and for public services.
Exactly.
Can the Minister help me to understand why it is we are expected to believe his assurance that the Government will bring forward a vote before the 21st in several weeks' time, when we were unable to believe the word that was given by Government ministers yesterday morning that there would be a vote today? And can I invite him to use a different expression? Rather than saying we will have a vote before the 21st of January, can he tell us in legal terms that this Government must have a vote before the 21st?
Well, I would say to the Honourable Lady that I've been very clear in my statement that the Government wants to follow both the spirit and the letter of the law. I think that is the answer to her question.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all have a fairly shrewd idea that no amount of sugarcoating is going to salvage this deal. It is dead in the water and is highly likely to fail when it does meet the test of a parliamentary vote. Given that situation, what contingency is the Government planning? They have agreed that it would be disastrous for us to crash out with no deal, so they're ruling out any option, including potentially unilaterally revoking the Article 50 declaration.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman talks about contingencies, and of course a huge amount of contingency work has been done, including by my honourable friend beside me on the bench. But we are very clear that we think the best way forward is to secure a deal, to make sure that we have the best deal possible, and that is exactly what the Prime Minister is fighting for.
Mike Gates.
Mr. Speaker, given the dysfunctional and duplicitous behaviour that we've seen in the last few days, wouldn't it be best if the Government listened to the very wise words of the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, speaking in Dublin today, who has asked for the revocation of Article 50?
Minister.
No, I don't believe it would be best. I think we have to remember that we were all elected on manifestos that respected the referendum result, and we have to deliver on that. And I do pay heed to Sir John Major when he makes the point about how important it is that we protect the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. That is exactly what we're seeking to do through the negotiations with the EU.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Government's handling of this whole thing has been woeful. After yesterday's shambles, I met with Reckitt's Ben Kaiser this morning, who were telling me that they're having to step up the preparations for a no-deal scenario, including having received a letter from the Secretary of State for Health saying that there could be problems at the port for up to 6 months, which would be major problems in terms of pharmaceuticals and getting raw materials into the country. So isn't it time now that we actually get on and have the vote? The Prime Minister will not bring back any major change to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Let's have the vote before Christmas, and then we can see in the new year what we need to do next.
Minister.
I'd say to the Honourable Lady, I regularly meet with pharmaceuticals businesses to talk to them about the government's plans for a deal and also no-deal contingency planning such as that she talks about. And I recognise that the industry strongly supports securing a deal that provides the implementation period, that provides a clear pathway ahead for trade. We want to see that delivered, and I think it's right that the Prime Minister to seek to put the best possible deal before this House.
Jack Dromey.
Mr Speaker, the success of Jaguar Land Rover in my constituency has transformed the lives of thousands of workers. But they now face a bleak new year. 6 weeks more of uncertainty takes us ever closer to the cliff. We must rule out, pending Parliament deciding where eventually we go, we must rule out no deal. Will therefore the government allow a vote next week on no deal, no Brexit?
Minister.
I've been very clear that the government will allow a meaningful vote. It will follow the wording of a letter and the spirit of the Withdrawal Act. But I say to the honourable gentleman, the best way to ensure the certainty that businesses crave is to make sure that we support, across this House, a withdrawal agreement that secures the implementation period and secures a good trade deal for our country.
Drew Hendry.
Mr Speaker, figures from yesterday show that his government spent £100,000 on social media promoting the Prime Minister's deal before withdrawing it from the vote. Will he do two things? First of all, will he apologise for squandering public money in that way? And will he also give a guarantee that he will waste no more public money on pointless propaganda during this needlessly extended process?
Minister.
I'd say to the honourable gentleman that the government is absolutely right in seeking to secure a deal which is in our national interest and the national interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, and we should continue to do so.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Minister acknowledge the enormous disquiet, not just on all sides of this House, but outside of this place, across our country, that the expected vote today, which was pulled, despite repeated promises, it was 100% going ahead. We've heard from Europe that there is no chance of any change to the deal. Will his government now take responsibility, stop this uncertainty, which he will have heard from countless colleagues as having such a detrimental impact on our businesses and also on our nation's mental health, and commit to bring forward the vote by Christmas so we can all start 2019 with some certainty?
Minister.
Well, I think the honourable lady has called for certainty. I think the best way for certainty is that this deal is brought back with the assurances which European capitals are already saying they can give to aid its ratification, and brought back to this House so that we can all get behind it, back it and provide that certainty.
Owen Smith.
Mr Speaker, yesterday's fiasco has done further damage to this country's once proud reputation for stability and good governance. Could the Minister explain to the House how another 40 days of drift and dither is going to help restore that battered reputation?
Minister.
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, who once had aspirations to lead the opposition, is that he might have provided perhaps less drift and dither from the opposition front bench. But what he wouldn't have done, I think, is to actually do what the Labour manifesto promised to do, which is to deliver on the outcome of the referendum.
Stangham Debonair.
Mr Speaker, I told my constituents in Bristol West that I would be voting against the government's deal this evening and that I'll be voting against no deal this evening. But the government has pulled those votes, and yesterday the Minister's boss said that he would not be revoking Article 50. So isn't the truth that this government is trying to hold a no-deal Brexit gun to the country's head?
Minister.
No, I respect the fact the honourable lady has always been consistent in her views on this issue. Of course, it is right to point out that those views conflict with the promises made in the last Labour manifesto. But this government is very clear. We want this House to be able to vote on a deal. We think that deal will be in the interests of our country, and we will be bringing that deal back to this House to vote on.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr Speaker, after yesterday's shenanigans, and let's face it, a total abuse of power by the executive, all trust in this government has broken down. So whilst I believe the Minister is being sincere, to restore trust, will he promise to have the Attorney's legal advice on Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act published? And will he also call for Article 50, the clock, to be stopped on that process?
Minister.
I have to say to the Honourable Lady is that we have been very clear on what our interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act is. This House will have a vote. We have committed to that meaningful vote in all the circumstances envisaged by Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act.
Mr. Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has to understand that why members on both sides of the House have little faith in what he's saying, because he keeps answering with Section 13 that there will be a vote. The reality is there was a business motion last week that was agreed and there would be a vote today, and the government has reneged on it, which is why we don't trust them. The language is extremely important that the Minister has been using in answering his questions, and he said that he hopes before the 21st of January, shortly, and the 21st of January will be the back end of when he expected to be a vote. So he clearly knows something, so set out now, when he answers my question, when the vote will come.
Well, Minister, I'm very honoured that the honourable gentleman believes I know something. I would encourage him to read the urgent question itself, which I've been responding to.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is relying on the House trusting it in bringing forward a meaningful vote in the future. But yesterday's escapade suggests that the government is not always dealing from the top of the pack. The leader of the House came in here yesterday and collapsed the business without making any reference to it at all. And it was moved by a minister of the government just shouting tomorrow. Now, it would help restore some of that trust, although that was a very difficult thing for the government to do, if it were to promise not to ever do that again in this process and give this House the opportunity to vote on any future changes in the business motion.
Minister. Well, I would generally say to the honourable gentleman that he's very generous in giving me such wonderful powers to make commitments on behalf of the government forevermore. But I have been clear today about the meaningful vote that this House will have. I have been clear about our interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act, and I do think that colleagues across the House should take that very clearly as the government's intention, what we are going to do, and I would therefore gently appeal for the trust that he talks about.
Thank you. Order. 10-minute rule motion. Norman Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to legalise the possession and consumption of cannabis, to provide for the regulation of the production, distribution and sale of cannabis, and for connected purposes. Over the last few weeks, 3 of my constituents have individually come to see me to discuss cannabis. All 3 suffer acute, continuing pain. One has fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis and IBS. He has been prescribed fentanyl, which we know is highly addictive and potentially fatal. He stopped taking it out of fear of the consequences. Yet cannabis offers him essential pain relief. But he has no option but to buy it illegally. He knows at any time that he could face arrest and prosecution. Following the government's reforms allowing for the prescribing of cannabis-based products for medicinal use, he went to see his GP to get a prescription. He was told that they, the GPs, were all under instructions not to refer patients to the pain clinic because there is no evidence of therapeutic value. Yet something as dangerous as fentanyl remains available. Another constituent who is rapidly advancing Parkinson's disease also uses cannabis. It's the only thing that helps him. He has also been told by his GP that he can't be referred to a specialist for cannabis to be prescribed. So we leave this man, who is acutely unwell, having to break the law in order to get relief from pain. This is surely cruel and inhuman. The third man, in his 50s, finds that cannabis is the only thing that offers him respite from pain following an injury to his leg. He has a lifelong allergy to codeine. Other painkillers have caused serious problems with his kidneys, but cannabis works for him. Fearing the risks of buying from a street dealer, he bought some over the internet. He then faced a police raid. Despite my pleas to the police that giving him a criminal record would not be in the public interest, last week he was given a caution. This man has been a law-abiding citizen all his life. He has found this whole thing acutely distressing. He fears that the consequence of the caution is that he won't be able to visit his son in Australia. The treatment of this man is shameful. What is the point of doing this to him? What is the possible public interest? Across the country, people like this are left with no option but to break the law. The government's reforms raised expectations but have dashed hopes for so many people. The approach taken by the government is so restrictive that the numbers who will benefit are minuscule. If you are lucky, you might live in an area where the police force takes an enlightened approach. Chief Constable Mike Barton in Durham has effectively decriminalised cannabis for personal use, and a recent parliamentary answer I received reveals that in some areas prosecutions and cautions have plummeted. Yet surely we can't justify this postcode lottery where two people behaving in exactly the same way are treated differently depending on where they live. One will be forever tarnished with a criminal record and the other won't. It is clear that the recent reforms are not working, so the government should look in the round at the harm that prohibition of cannabis is causing across the country and try to come up with a more enlightened approach. In Canada, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau has implemented a new legal regulated market for cannabis for recreational and medicinal use. Their approach is instructive. In June 2016, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Health jointly set out the key principles which should guide reform, including protecting young people by keeping cannabis out of the hands of children and youth, keeping profits out of the hands of criminals, preventing people from receiving criminal records for simple cannabis possession, reducing the burden on the police and the justice system, protecting public health and safety by strengthening the law with respect to serious offences such as selling cannabis to minors and driving under the influence, providing support for addiction treatment, mental health support and education programmes to inform people about the risks, access to quality-controlled cannabis for medicinal purposes. Surely these principles should guide us too. Carrying on as we are has dreadful consequences. And I want to just make 4 key points. First, nowhere across the world has prohibition worked. Cannabis is available everywhere. Second, people have no idea what they are buying. We know that leaving supply in the hands of criminals puts particularly teenagers at risk. They are the most susceptible to suffering mental health consequences, including psychosis, from regular use of potent strains available on the street. The widespread use of these dangerous strains is the result of our failure to regulate. A regulated market would allow governments to control the safety and potency of cannabis sold by legal vendors. Yet through a misplaced desire to be tough on drugs, we leave teenagers vulnerable to exploitation from sellers who have no interest at all in their welfare. Through inaction, government and parliament are culpable. If something is potentially dangerous to children and young people, control it and regulate it. Don't leave it freely available from those keen to make a fast buck. Third, we know that the illegal market for drugs generates extreme violence in many communities, particularly the most disadvantaged. If a supplier faces competition, they don't resort to the courts to protect their market, they use extreme violence. Thousands of people have lost their lives as a result of illegal trade in drugs in countries like Mexico, but on the streets of our poorest communities, violence is meted out regularly. Young, vulnerable teenagers get caught up in this violent trade and can't escape. Yet it doesn't have to be like this. Fourth, we still criminalise thousands of people every year taking up precious police time which could be used to fight serious crime. Careers are blighted for using a substance which no doubt many people on the government benches have used at some stage in their lives. Meanwhile, the most harmful drug of all is consumed in large quantities right here in this building. Alcohol leads to violence on our streets and behind closed doors in people's homes. It destroys families up and down our country, yet we tax it and the Exchequer benefits enormously from it. Isn't there a dreadful hypocrisy that we allow our drug of choice whilst criminalising people who use another, less dangerous drug, many for the relief of pain? My bill, Mr. Speaker, offers a more rational alternative to this mess, with strict regulation of the growing, sale and marketing of cannabis, with an age limit of 18 for the purchase and consumption of cannabis, with clear controls over potency of what is sold in licensed outlets. We can at last start to protect children and teenagers. We can at last treat all those people who suffer acute pain or who have conditions such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's and epilepsy with dignity and respect. We can end the shameful treatment of these people as criminals. We can at last end the extraordinary practice of handing billions of pounds every year to organised crime. We can instead start to tax the sale of cannabis so that revenues can be used for good purpose, public health education, the NHS, schools and the police. We can start to take some of the violence and intimidation off our streets and restore order in our poorest communities. We can free up police time to focus on serious crime. Mr. Speaker, this is rational, evidence-based policy making. It's time for this country to act on the evidence and to protect children and young people from harm.
Order. The question is that the right honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr. Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I first of all want to pay respect to the right honourable member for North Norfolk for introducing this bill. I know that he has a long record of campaigning on this issue, and whilst I strongly disagree with him, I do respect his desire that something be done to address this very important issue, because I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that something does need to be done about the current situation with cannabis use in its current form that is wrong and unsustainable and doing a great deal of damage to our society. But I do not believe that liberalising it in the way that has just been proposed and decriminalising it will be the answer. Part of my view is largely informed by experience that I have had personally of seeking to help and support people who have been regular users of cannabis, and I've seen very close up and first hand the lives that it wrecks, the impact on mental health that it has, and the cost that it not only has to the individuals, but to their families, to their communities and to wider society. And I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, I was slightly confused in the line that he was taking, because he seemed to be confusing medical use for cannabis with recreational use. And I think the government should take great credit for the progress that has been made recently in allowing the use of cannabis products for medical use, and that is absolutely right, and I believe has a great deal of support across the country. And I would agree with the argument that more should be done to ensure that cannabis for medical use gets to the people who really need it. And I would agree with the point that more needs to be done to get medical professionals on board and for them to adjust to the new regime. But let's remember, these new measures were only introduced just a few weeks ago on the 1st of November, and I think we need to give more time to allow these changes to come into effect before we take a huge leap of faith towards decriminalising cannabis altogether. My concern is that by liberalising cannabis use, we will be sending precisely the wrong message to our young people. We will be giving them the message that somehow cannabis is safe and okay to use. And I believe we need to make very clear that cannabis is a dangerous drug and there is no safe use in an uncontrolled way, in an unregulated way, for cannabis to be consumed. We are clearly in the midst of a war on drugs. But I would say that we do not win the war by raising the white flag and giving up and surrendering. No war has ever been won by surrendering. It's been well established the impact of regular cannabis use on mental health. There is strong evidence that demonstrates that frequent use of cannabis is linked to the inducement of psychosis. One study in South London revealed that there was a threefold increase in the risk of individuals having a psychotic disorder amongst regular cannabis users compared to those who do not use cannabis. In recent years, we have seen a steady decline in steady reduction in the use of cannabis. Over the last 20 years, it has declined by 30%. YouGov polling conducted this year indicates that legislation could significantly disturb this overall downward trend. Over a quarter of people under 25 who have never tried cannabis before indicated that they would definitely or would be likely to try it if it was legalised. That is over 1 million 18 to 24-year-olds. Of those who have used cannabis before, well over a third of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they would be more likely to use it more regularly if it was decriminalised. I believe that legislation would send a very wrong message to our young people that cannabis is okay to use. And I think we all understand that for many people, the use of cannabis is a gateway drug to more serious and more damaging drug use. And therefore, it would be absolutely wrong to send this message that somehow cannabis is okay because of where it would lead for many, many people. Of course, as with most laws, the Misuse of Drugs Act is adhered to by the vast majority of people, but it is ignored by some. We must not forget that the current law does deter a great many from drug use, and this serves a very important public interest. But this is no endorsement of the status quo. We all have at least some common ground here. It is intolerable to see our young people hurting themselves or ending their lives prematurely because of the effects of this dangerous drug. Our approach must be bolder. We must be offering more meaningful support and aim to drive consumption down yet further. This will not be achieved by a new website or a helpline. We need to intervene and challenge, using experts in the field of drug use, recovered addicts and recovering users, who can reach out and invite a real prospect of change for users. A procedure that replaces the current system of issuing a relatively ineffectual warning or punitive fine given by a police officer with an alternative of offering diversion through the attendance of a local drug awareness day would have a greater impact in reducing use. Our part of what is currently charged as a fixed penalty notice could go instead to local treatment providers to pay for the service.
Yeah, very good.
The Right Honourable Gentleman referred to the situation in Canada. But it's interesting that on the eve of the legislation being introduced in Canada, an article published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal referred to the legislation as a national uncontrolled experiment in which the profits of cannabis producers and tax revenues are squarely pitched against the health of Canadians. Yes, we can learn from experiments taking place elsewhere, but we don't need to risk the lives of some of our most vulnerable residents to do that. This is one of the many substances that plagues our communities and rob both young and old, and predominantly the most disadvantaged of a full life. We must commit to do more, to have a person-centric approach, to show compassion, yet keep the decisiveness of criminal law to intervene when the public interest demands it. I accept that there is a trend from other nations to legalise cannabis, but the evidence at this stage is still very mixed. Decriminalisation, at best, is a risky step for us to take. And whilst I understand the desire for something to be done to address this issue, I do not believe that liberalisation in this way is right for our country at this time. We need to do better for our young people, but giving up the war on cannabis is not the way to achieve that. I cannot support this bill, and if the House does divide on this issue, I will be voting against it, and I would encourage other members to join me to not allow this bill to progress.
Order. The question is that the right honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobby.